Justice Madlanga, thank you very much for talking to us at Anchored in Law, the unembedded take on law.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. Now, just kick off with, what was the trigger to you joining the bench?
It's a longish circuitous story. Growing up, I was never sure what I wanted to do, except for when I was very young. You know, growing up in the rural areas, a rural village outside of the small town of Mount Frere. The only times I would go to town would be when my parents would take me to the doctor. And I really loved the doctor's wheeled chair, you know. The doctor would reverse that way, backwards, and then forwards. And I said, I want to become a doctor when I grow up. Obviously, the reason was just for that chair. But as I grew up, I totally, lost any ideas as to what I wanted to become. But what very strangely perhaps used to be uppermost in my mind was to drive those huge articulated trucks. I really loved those trucks. I could tell them apart, just by sound, not even seeing them. I could tell that's a Mack, it's an American truck, an International Pacer, an Oshkosh, and so on and so on. Just hearing them, I love them.
And so when did
So I thought, I want to be a truck driver. And I think second, I wanted to be a teacher. And then a distant third, I think I reverted to my childhood life to become a doctor. Then when I was doing matric, my late father said, wouldn't you be interested in doing law? I said, oh, okay, yes, I think I'd love that. And indeed, the following year, I registered for law. But our system being what it was in 1980 when I registered for law, at that stage, it would have been quite unrealistic for one to think that one would ever become a judge. Perhaps that sounds pessimistic, but...
Why is that, though?
I'm saying, I may sound very pessimistic, but the realities at the time were judgeship is for whites and even at that for white males, because I think at that stage there was just Madam Justice Van den Heefer, a woman. So in a sense, it looked quite unrealistic that one could ever become a judge. But of course, with time and things changing, and of course my focus being becoming an advocate, yes, in later years, becoming a judge did become a reality, and it was, so to speak, within my sights, but at a very late stage, much later stage.
So the law bug and becoming a judge bit when there was a suggestion made by
My late father.
Your late father.
Yeah.
But was there anything in your experience that drew you in that direction?
Not really. I mean, you and I have, and many others out there have often heard stories of people being drawn to the law because of maybe personal experiences or even experiences of close family, friends, and so on. Yes, as a South African, black South African in particular, I was subjected to that. I was subjected to those experiences, but never caused me to think of doing law. It just never did.
For those who may not know the detail, what experiences? Can you give us some examples?
Not experiences in the sense of personally being detained, personally being arrested in connection with, security-related legislation. But as a South African, a black South African, the mere fact of the subjection of your people the subjugation of your people in the manner in which our people were. That is an experience to you as well, for as long as you are a human being with feelings. But coming closer to what maybe is a better answer to your question, I was in, perhaps in a small way, also involved in, the struggle. I was part of the student movements, but more particularly, more positive or concrete action. An example would be in 1984, I had just completed my junior degree at the University of Transkei. And I was waiting to go to Rhodes to do my LLB the following year, 1985. At the University of Transkei, there was a strike, and many of my former fellow students were arrested, and others escaped arrest. A prominent one amongst those was Bathandwa Ndondo. And you may perhaps know his name because in our student days we even used to have Bathandwa Ndondo Day. And we would commemorate that, and that was the day on which he was killed by apartheid operatives, including Transkei police. Bathandwa Ndondo, Tobile Bam, what's his name now? But his surname is Mbalu. His first name escapes me now. They came to live with me as I had already graduated, so I was leaving off. I was no longer on campus. They came to live with me at Kwezi Township in Mthatha. And the police were looking for them, and Bathandwa was one of the most sought after by the police. And I was living with my cousin, and my cousin had a caravan parked in the yard. So Bathandwa and Mr. Mbalu, let me call him that, they would sleep in the caravan. Toby Lebam, who was also a close friend of mine and a homeboy coming from Mount Frere, we would sleep in the house. So what we would do is, very early in the morning, Bathandwa and Mr. Mbalu would come into the house before the sun was up, and they would be in the house all day. And then in the evening, after the sun was down and they had had supper, they would go back into the caravan. And here's an interesting part. At that time, in partial compliance with my obligations towards a bursary, Transkei Department of Justice bursary, I was working at the magistrate's office. I would meet in the corridors people like Mr. Boy and Mr. Dengana, who were the most notorious security police in the Transkei. And because I was a junior magistrate, when they meet me in the corridors, they would greet me, "Hello, Mhlekazi," sir, in our language. And I remember I used to say, or think, and even say to friends, if Dengana and Boy were to know that I'm harboring people like Bathandwa where I live, bangandithena, which means they would castrate me. And not just them, even, somebody more known to the South African populace generally.
Jonas. Yes.
Jonas.
Yes.
Jonas.
Okay.
He and Mr. Kaya Mabekwe came to me at the magistrate's office. They had been my contemporaries at Rhodes University. And at that time, people who didn't want to sneak out of the country in the sense of crossing borders outside of the border gates, would actually get the so-called Transkei passports. So Mbuyiseli Jonas and Kaya Mabekwe came to me all the way. Kaya was from King Williamstown. I think Mbuyiseli was from even further away from Mthatha. And they asked me to help them get the Transkei passport, and which I did. And those days, I guess one shouldn't care about, oh, this judge lied, you know. We would just go there and literally lie and say, I know this person, and we come from such and such a village within Transkei and blah, blah, blah. And then the officials within the Department of Interior and Transkei would then issue those passports. You know.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the circumstances called for it. There is such a thing as a defense of necessity, even in murder.
So we are with a few other people as well. I was Vuile Bam, who was the younger brother to the Tobile Bam I've mentioned. With him, I drove him out because there was no way I could have taken him to the magistrate's office. He and several others had been released. They had been detained for, I think, about 2 years without trial. Eventually, the Transkei government brought them to court. And a friend of mine who was a magistrate, he's now a South African citizen, he came from Uganda, Joseph Lukwako Mugerwa. He struck the case off the roll. Can you believe it? It's a security-related matter. He struck it off the roll. And they were in B court. B court had 4 doors, a door there, another one there. You should have seen the accused, you know, run in all directions, jumping over the dock like that, through all those 4 doors and running away. So Wile Bam was amongst them. So he too, that same night, came to stay with me, still at Kwezi Locus, at Ikwezi Township. And there was no way I could have taken him, like I had done with them, Jonas and Kaya Mapek. I could have taken him to the magistrate's office. So I took him to a neighboring town, Libote, and there as well we did the same thing. And the fortunate thing was also, even within the clerical staff, there would be people who were willing to assist us. Like in the Mthatha Magistrates Court, we were helped by Miss Zigao, sister to late Minister Zigao.
Yes.
Then in Libo, there was helped by a close friend of mine who was an assistant magistrate there, Sillo Mabuye. So he helped us with this. So in you know, in a very small way, but you know, a way which was quite risky if you were to be caught. You know. I had sort of graduated by the time I took Sivuile. I had a small car. But when Batandwa, Tobile, and Mr. Mbalu were with me, I had a motorcycle then. So at night, I would ride with one of them, would run their personal errands and would ride back home, you know. Quite risky. I mean, you could easily meet up with police and get arrested, but we had to do it.
Let's take up your experience as a junior magistrate in the Eastern Cape. Was it in Mthatha?
It was in Mthatha.
Some time ago. Yes. Any highlights there?
Other than the law itself, I would say highlights were more the boxing matches that one would have with the quote-unquote superiors. You know? I don't know whether I should mention the name. I would readily mention it if I knew that he is deceased. I don't know. But the chief magistrate there at the time, we would call meetings on Wednesdays, and he was pro-state, pro-security legislation out and out. And on this one Wednesday, he said to us, magistrates should never question, you know, security-related legislation. If somebody is arrested in connection with those, you should never even think of granting them bail.
And we're talking mid-1980s now?
This is mid-1980s, early to mid-1980s. So I was very young then, I mean in my 20s, early 20s actually. And there were lots of magistrates there, some quite elderly, black and white. And I, being the youngest, I said, Mr. So-and-so, yes, you are my superior, but that's only with regard to, you know, you running the court as an institution, but not with regard to what I do in the courtroom. There you cannot interfere. I would not feel that I am a magistrate worth his salt. If I were to listen to you with regard to what I should do in the courtroom. He was quite taken aback, but I mean, he was a lawyer, he was a magistrate, and he knew that I was right. He was just stunned and had no response at all.
So you asserted your independence as a judicial officer at that early stage in your early 20s,
yeah,
even
in that sort of context. Yeah.
And even before there was a section 165(4) of the Constitution.
Exactly.
Mm.
Exactly. But I was happy because I was in the company, even though they did not speak at that meeting. I was in the company of, similarly-minded people like the Joe Kwako that I mentioned, struck a security-related matter off the road.
Yes.
There was also Mr. D.D. Ndima, so
Yes.
I was in good company, so
Yes.
to speak. Yeah.
So you then progressed from being a magistrate. Did you go into private practice as an advocate before you ascended to the High Court bench?
Yes, I was appointed to the High Court bench coming from the profession of that.
From the profession. For how long had you practiced?
That was actually, it came as a surprise because even though earlier I said, once one became an advocate, one did think of becoming a judge. At the time it happened, I did not in the least think it was going to happen at that stage. Because I was, how many years in practice? This was in 1996 and I started practice 1st July 1991. So do your maths, it was a very short
4 to 5 years, yeah.
And Ted Beck, Justice Beck, who was the judge president in Tata, just called me out of the blue and said I should go and act in the first half of 1996. I acted, I think, for about 4 months, and then 1st September I became a permanent judge in 1996. I was not expecting it. I was still quite young. I mean, I think I was 34.
34, sure. One of the youngest judges.
I was the youngest at that time. I was the youngest at that time.
Yes. Now, was that the time before the Judicial Service Commission, or had it just started?
I had to go through that
process. Yes. It must have been unnerving.
It was.
Yes.
But those were, the times when, by and large, barring instances where perhaps, there would be something negative about a candidate. Those were the days when, a judge president's preference usually got the nod. So,
you then no sooner became a High Court judge than you became an acting judge president. How did that come about?
I first acted at the Supreme Court of Appeal, and that too was within a very short space of time. And I was to have acted there for a year, that is 4 terms. That was cut short because Judge President Somyalo was taken to Grahamstown. And then as a stopgap, whilst I was continuing to act at the Supreme Court of Appeal, the retired Judge President Beck that I spoke about earlier was brought in. And then I came over and took over from him.
So you were,
I'm made to understand that it had everything to do with the late Dala Omar.
Oh, I see. But I'm sure it must have been not so much a political favor as the competence and the promise that they saw in you.
I think with him it would more have been, he was strongly for transformation. So from his angle, yes, that is what he would have had in mind. But I think in terms of the law and in terms of what you have just said, I think the Judge President, that is Judge President Somyalo, would have had an influence as well.
Okay. I think let's park it there for now and then take up in the next segment your experiences in the Constitutional Court.